I have a lot of these really thin cutoffs around the shop here. I get them from a local mill shop, and they're usually just over 1.5 inches wide, which really isn't big enough to make a whole lot of stuff. I have some sapele, white oak, and maple, and I've never actually made a cutting board before, so in this video that's what I'm going to do. These boards have all been surface planed on one side and edge jointed on one edge by the mill shop. So the first thing I will do is plane them all to the same thickness, which is right around 1.5 inches. And once they are all the same thickness, they'll be a whole lot easier to glue up. You can see I clearly need to empty my dust collector there. So with all of my pieces now planed nice and smooth, I can now work on removing all the rough edges and cutting each piece to a uniform 1.5 inches wide. And for this operation, my new flip-up outfeed table was a huge help. If you want more information on that, there'll be a link to that video down in the description. And since I hate wasting wood, you can see that there was a minimal waste. And here is a schematic that I used to draw up what the cutting board would look like. A link to that website will also be in the description, and here is what the final product should look like. So now I just need to put all of the boards in the correct order according to the schematic, and then start the glue up. I'm using Type Bond 3 here, which has a slightly longer open time than Type Bond 1, which gives me a little more time to make sure that the glue up is perfect. There are times when you can skimp on glue, but this is not one of them. You have to use plenty of glue to make sure that all of these boards are really firmly attached to each other, or else you will end up with problems with your final product. A few hours later, and the glue is dry enough for me to work with the panel. I will remove the clamps and then use a card scraper to remove some of the dried off glue. This will help to make the surfaces flatter to make it easier for my planer to get both sides perfectly smooth. So now I run it through the planer on both sides, and I have to say I am loving this new DeWalt planer with the helical cutter head. It really leaves a super smooth surface. Now I will use my crosscut sled to cut strips from this slab. First I need to just trim the edge, and now I am cutting all of these strips at 1.5 inches wide. The slab itself is 1.5 inches thick, so this makes all of the pieces nice and uniform. And again, because I hate wasting wood, I will have to find a use for this scrap later. I'll just set it aside for now. Now I'm going to arrange all the pieces in order and just line them up. There's really no reason to do this, but I just like the way it looks. And now I'm flipping each piece end grain up, and then I will flip around every other piece to get the pattern from the template. As I was arranging them here, I realized this would look just too big for one board, so I'm making it into 2 boards instead. And now it's time for the glue up, and you'll notice at the end there's a 1/4 inch piece of white oak. That is going to be to catch any tear out when I put this glued up piece back through my planer. And I know putting end grain cutting boards through a surface planer is controversial. Unfortunately, I don't have a drum sander, and end grain is very, very hard to sand by hand. So I'm going to use my planer, just taking very, very thin cuts, and I think it should be just fine. And here we go, putting end grain through the planer. Again, I'm taking extremely thin cuts, only about 1/128th of an inch, or about 0.2 millimeters with each pass. Everything seems to be going fine. There is a little bit of tear out on that extra oak strip, but everything really looks great. And here you can see there's actually just a little bit of tear out on that oak strip, but the surface of the cutting board looks perfect. So I'll just remove that extra strip, and now I will start gluing up the second cutting board. It'll be processed the exact same way, again with the extra oak strip, first glued, and then trimmed, and then planed. And now my favorite part, sanding. Again, end grain is extremely tough to sand, so I started with 80 grit, moved my way up to 120, then 150, 220, 400, and 600. Overall, each board took about 2 hours to sand, but at the end, each surface was nice and smooth. So here I'm using a 1/8 round-over bit to round over the edges, and see, I told you I would find a use for that scrap. This is just to test to make sure that the height of the bit was fine. So now I'm rounding over all of the edges on both sides. I probably should have done that before doing all the sanding, because running it through the router made little tiny scratches on both sides that I then had to resand. So now I'm working on the second cutting board. Again, it was glued and then scraped, put through the planer, and then that extra piece of oak trimmed off. And then the edges rounded over on both sides, and then more sanding. Again, this took about 2 hours for this board, starting with the random orbital sander and then hand sanding the edges. After that was done, I used a tack cloth to remove all of the fine sawdust from both sides of each board. I'm going to use mineral oil to finish the boards. They sell products called cutting board oil or butcher block oil, but those are just food-grade mineral oil, which you can also buy in the drugstore. It's exactly the same product, but about 1/4 the price. And I apologize for the slow-mo, but the mineral oil just instantly makes the grain pop and finally brings out what the board is going to look like. End grain soaks up a lot of oil, so I had to apply a couple of times and let it soak in for a good hour or two before letting them dry overnight on a cooling rack. And then I'll use something called cutting board butter, which is a homemade mixture of mineral oil and food-grade beeswax. After wiping off any excess oil, I rub on some of the cutting board butter, let it sit for an hour or two, and then buff it off. This was a really fun project, a really good use of scraps, and a really useful one too, because I can use these in my kitchen. End grain cutting boards are extremely durable, and here is what they look like. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.